I'll give an overview of each of them today, and then we'll proceed through them in the first half of the course. But the new theories are seriously challenging the old, but the salience of how we look at this, let me start with a classic example, is I'm going to show like this. We got concentric circles, and in Chicago, this has been called the Burgess zones. And you then have below it a little normal distribution. And the idea is that price is high when you're at the center of the city, and as you move out to further zones, prices generally go down. If this is this has been called a central place theory, and it's a core idea in urban geography, economics, sociology. It had in Europe the name of the Von Thunen, T-H-U-N-E-N, central place, or Burgess in Chicago. That central end is the most valuable. It focused on business, which required face-to-face contact. But let me ask you, why might this change? Well, no, or let me ask you, what might be the driver of this simple theory as shown here? Why is land at the center more valuable? The old answer was people can talk to one another in person. This was before the telephone, before anything like that. And so in order to do business, you needed to be near the center, and you could talk to people more easily and do better. I mean, that was the sort of the simplest version of the idea. Actually, yeah, okay, we are recording, so just announcement of that. We hope to participate, engage you all, and have access in that way afterward. Just turn on. I'm just going to turn on my voice as a backup, which we usually do too. Brian Barry was a professor here, was one of the two top geographers in the world, still is. And he worked with this theory basically for 20, 30 years. He was one of the most articulate in book after book in elaborating aspects of it. Then he gave it up. Why did he give it up? He did a study where he looked at the degree to which first the central place theory was there, but he also added the later versions of what were called the old 1920s Chicago school, including such things as rail lines, streets, parks, and some other things which could change these patterns a little bit. And he found in a model like this, a statistical model of land price for every land parcel in the Chicago metro area, when he repeated this analysis in 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, on up to the 70s or so, that the model got weaker and weaker and weaker, and the individual components of distance got weaker and weaker. So let me ask you, why? Why did the model, and was this a good model in the mid and late 19th century, and a weaker and weaker model through the 20th century? What changed? And this is illustrative of how the different theories we're going to look at may vary in their importance. So we're not just looking at one theory versus another, we're looking at where and how they may change, and we can integrate them with each other. Who can give us a suggestion? Just unmute and say a word or two just of a simple factor.
The emergence of the telephone.
Okay, absolutely. So the telephone initially, and then the cell in the late 19th, and then the cell phone with more in the 21st century. This is the simple, most obvious answer. What might be a second one? So in a sense, communication. Communication was technologically improved. What would be another sort of related kind of answer?
Transportation.
Absolutely. Two people, two answers, number one and number two. You have hit the bullseye both times. This is what people have said through the 20th century. So this is going to be a good class. Okay. So what Barry said, if these things used to explain a moderate amount, but they get weaker and weaker, what are we going to, that is, does anything else explain the value of land? And, or why is it, what can we do given these changes? All right, this is paradigmatic or illustrative of the point I'm making, that these 5 theories are not necessarily totally right or totally wrong. They each can have some explanatory power, but you have just given reasons why they may change. So I will point to a class of these and introduce them with 2 dates for some pretty revolutionary changes. 1968 and 1989. 1968 was a quasi-revolutionary compared to today. It seems sort of like today. There were big urban disturbances of the sort we've had in the last 6 months in major U.S. cities, going on across the whole U.S. There was looting, there was burning, and people said, "Wow, this is the end of the world," or "This is the end of what the things as we knew it." Others said, we want to participate more. And the big obvious factors going on in 68, anybody want to try to mention 1 or 2?
Civil rights movement.
Yeah, go ahead.
Civil rights movement and Vietnam.
Absolutely. Okay, those are 2 of the most critical. The civil rights movement was mounting through the 60s. 68 was considered a high point in terms of a number of factors at that time. Number of disturbances, number of killings, number of shootings, etc. And obviously the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King was peaceful, but there were byproducts as well. But it was also a call for participation, for access to the political system, and for, of course, underlying that equality, more equality for more people. And the visible barrier was racial discrimination, as you've heard in more recent discussions too. There were, how about one or two other factors? I think someone started to say something. We're now shifting a little bit away from the direct cause, and we're asking about the context, what there was in the context, the historical era that made that period different.
In the 60s, there's some Cold War as well.
Okay, this was the Cold War was still active, and one byproduct of that Cold War in 68 was was what, especially for the US?
Space race.
Space race, but
Arms.
yes, but what was there that, I mean, that in a sense was, I would say, more integrating and gave a sense of pride within the US. What might have led to disturbances and fighting within the US instead as a byproduct of the Cold War? Was there a hot war going on anywhere in 1968? It's called the Vietnam War. And college students in those days were drafted. You didn't get to pay your higher taxes and have a professional soldier fight for you, as students have been doing in the wars in the last 20 years. There was universal service, and everyone had to serve in some way. There were various ways around. There were student deferments, etc. But students in particular felt very much at risk that they could go and be killed fairly directly. There were lots more people killed in Vietnam than in other wars. So the Vietnam War, and one more factor you may not be so aware of is unionization, especially at the city level. Federal, state, and local governments were not allowed to be unionized in those years. And so there was pressure by state and local, especially people marching in front of city halls who said unionization. So you had lines of protesters, unionization for municipal employees, anti-Vietnam War protests, especially by students. I'll add one more. The students also said, what did they have as another demand in those days? Which links us again to present. Students wanted more equal participation in the governance of the universities. And you have a similar pressure now with the theme. And so I'm as you can almost hear, I'm leading to things which we're dealing with today, many of which fall under the heading of diversity. But my point is 68 had a lot in common with the diversity and the overlapping elements that we confront today. And I'll just say now, we're going to tentatively use aspects of diversity as we go through the entire course and look where and how diversity may interact, may shift the processes that we're talking about. So when I say shift the processes, I'm holding this up. Is this, okay, what this has is first a little model which has A, B, C, 3 causes like transportation, communication, other factors could be education. So ABC may be 3 reasons that land value is higher in the center of a city. But what we all are also doing, and the benefit of this course and of studying cities, is that we don't just look at one city and one theory. We've got variations across cities. Some cities do more, some cities do less. We can count the number of shootings, we can count the number of arrests, we can count different things, and there are important differences across cities and then across countries. And so I'm showing you then the same kind of picture, ABC, but the difference is in the upper corner of that box, I have a little diagonal line. And I'm doing this in a very crude way so I can control it this first day. And I'm not having a slick PowerPoint you will forget. I'm drawing these as if we were on the blackboard. These little corner lines I'll put right up here close, I'm suggesting, we can call C1 or C2 for City 1 or City 2, or Context 1. That is, the context can transform the workings, and I will now add a little A, a little B, and a little C, a little A, a little B, and a little C, and I'll leave off the subscripts just to show you one here. So here we've got the big A leads to Y, the big B leads to Y. Then there's a lowercase a, B, C, and that can be seen as a causal coefficient, or at least a potentially causal coefficient. And the point is, we can ask, why is A, B, or C stronger in general and stronger in a particular city, if we have enough cases to be able to measure this within a particular city? If we go down to things like zip codes or blocks, we can have enough cases to generate these kinds of paths within individual cities. All right, so and we've illustrated this already with the idea that land value and transportation and communication have weakened the path from distance. In similar manner, we're going to have multiple other factors changing. And so I pointed to 1980 to 68 as a first one, which led to some of the paths changing. The paths from 68, we could more generally describe as more cultural, let's say more cultural and political than economic and geographic or physical. So the cultural political aspects, the war, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the press for unionization, these are more cultural and political. And Brian Barry, I mentioned, he left this field. He stopped doing this kind of research, he said, because the tradition, or he didn't put it quite as clearly as I will now. He said things have changed, but the two big things which were omitted by the simple version of the zone theory were culture and politics. Those are big headings, and we'll elaborate them as we proceed. But the idea of meaning and other things coming together through political and social and cultural processes were not present in the simple geographic physical distance theory. But do we still have physical distance? Yes. In the 21st century, it's still there, but the causal path gets weaker and weaker. And this happens in life, that things change with the context, and that in turn changes the dynamic of the theory. So in a sense, that's the structure of the model which we're using in introducing these 5 theories. That we've got paths for what we call direct effects. The little a, little b, little c is a direct effect. The C1, C2 is an interaction effect, which says the relations among everything change. So one could talk in simple path terms in this manner. We don't, but I'm not trying to. This course does not assume any knowledge of any quantitative training or expertise. If you have some such training, you will find some of these points elaborated in some of the readings. But this course is open to anybody at any level in the college, and all of the basic ideas should be clear to you. And if not, please ask. But we're not assuming any knowledge of statistics or math or modeling or anything like that, even if it's in the background in the way that I've just explained with the Brian Barry example. I'll introduce a second kind of point here briefly, which is that the Chicago approach led many people to say, hey, Chicago, well, let's say Burgess and people around Burgess, Park and Burgess published a book called The City, which had some other core ideas. And these were considered by many people in the entire world to be the center of urban analysis, or at least urban sociology, but in those years, to a considerable degree, aspects of urban economics, urban geography as well. The social sciences were generally #1 in the US in those years at the University of Chicago. And one reason is that, and this was not true in the arts and humanities. The humanities were weaker here than at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, for instance. So why were we stronger? One answer, and why were we specifically stronger for urban things? Max Weber, the great social scientist, came here to see the World's Fair in 1890, where the Museum of Science and Industry still lies as a building constructed then. And he said, it's fantastic to come to Chicago because it's like a person with his or her skin cut off. You can see the palpitating organs inside more visibly than we can in a place with thicker, if you will, civilization like a Paris or a Beijing. So in that sense, the looting of the last 6 months, the open conflicts and discussion of who gets you jobs, clientelism, racial politics, discrimination, these have been much more visible, critical, but openly discussed. I have multiple times invited aldermen and others to come to class, and they'll talk openly about patronage, jobs, who do I reward if I've got a job, and so forth, in ways that if you came from New York or Los Angeles or Boston, you would say, oh my God, we don't talk about that in Los Angeles or New York or Boston. Okay, so in that sense, the visibility of the inner palpitating organs and the ironic, humorous jokes that go with it. They call us machine politicians because we're coin operated. If you invited the council members would say this to me and in class. If you want to have a party with the council members, you can say, not invited unless indicted. Okay, so there's a sense of we're borderline legal, we're taking money, we're making it into a machine. This has been joke material for some time. Okay, the first kind of theory, so I'm now going to go, sorry, let me just finish with one or two more general points as general background. I'll mention that the city of Los Angeles was thus seen as another model by especially people in LA. A group of them got together and did a book and called it the LA School, to challenge the Chicago School of the 1920s, which brought you the Burgess-Sohn kind of theory and other stuff. And they said explicitly, Chicago represents the old European high-density pre-automobile city. LA represents the modern city of the post-automobile, the high-tech, the communication into the suburbs, and so forth. And we need a new model to understand this. Okay, this in turn led to a third, the New York School, which articulated itself more in terms of a neo-Marxist perspective. So the three people from the three cities are continually now in some degree of debate. And so we've had many books in the last 20 years arguing over what are these perspectives, and if there were about just these three cities, people in the rest of the world wouldn't care. But these are articulating bigger theories that we'll talk about as we proceed. Marxism, postmodernism combine in the LA school. A Frankfurt sociology tradition lies behind them, which we'll get to that as we proceed in the course. But just as a quick label, New York didn't have the postmodernist element. It had a more hierarchical economic determinist sort of pattern as background. Chicago, by contrast, in more recent years, has seen more, in addition to the Burgess zones, as a city of neighborhoods. And the term community is used in a loose way, but it mostly has meaning as an ethnic group. So the Chicago neighborhoods are more visibly ethnic, and political lines are more explicitly drawn to maintain ethnic solidarity around a particular ethnic group. This was the immigration pattern of the white ethnic groups at the end of the 19th century, the Poles, the Germans, the Irish. There were militias in the early and mid 19th century that formed into battalions in the Civil War when they went to fight. These militias, Tocqueville didn't come to Chicago, but Tocqueville might have found the beginnings of these, and there were bits of these across other cities in the U.S. But the point is, the aspect of guns and violence have been there for a long time. There was a mayor named Boone. He was a grandson, I believe, of Daniel Boone of the coonskin cap, and he was elected on the Know Nothing Party, and its simple program was keep out the people who are not Americans. And one of his first actions was to fire the Irish policeman. Any Irishman who was a policeman would be fired. When this was announced, the Irish militia, one Irish militia started to march on City Hall. And this Irish militia had more marchers than the City Hall police. And so he not only did Mayor Boone call out the police, and he then tried to contact, as fast as he could without a cell phone, other militias to defend City Hall from the onslaught of what was happening right then. So looting and the problems of the mayor today and the critique from Trump last night, etc., this has been going on for some time, and arguments over who's right or wrong. That is, the Know Nothing Party was not a Chicago party, it was a national political party. So these debates are still with us, and they're part of American history. Tocqueville focused not on the violent part, Tocqueville focused on participation, and that participation could build legitimacy. And that clearly interacts with these things. But let me then go to theory with this quick background. Frame this as saying the political and the cultural have been there longer than was recognized in the first physical distance theory, and we can bring them in ways that we'll play these off as we proceed. But in the readings, the number one class of reading today, which is most frequently discussed and stressed by both of the candidates, but especially by the modest President Trump, was that the leader matters. If your name is president and your name is Trump, you can do a better job because of your personal style. Okay, this goes back to de Gaulle, this goes back to Caesar, this goes back to names, the Eisenhower years. The name of the leader is meant to describe a whole outlook. And this is a general way of characterizing history, political, and especially urban leadership. The Daily Chicago. The regime was a name for this, which came in with Clarence Stone, but the general terms, community power, the community power structure, hierarchy, domination, the business elite, these are things which have been labeled and identified and fought over in cities more than nations. I sometimes say that nations are dinosaurs and cities are fruit flies because they vary in how much these patterns are going on. And because we can compare hundreds and thousands of cities and they're more extreme in the ways that they may pursue different combinations of these, we can build a better science with fruit flies than we can with dinosaurs. Similarly, more decisions are made at a lower and lower level, not just the city, but also the neighborhood, the block, and so forth. Floyd Hunter built on the Robert and the Lind analysis of the 30s, Hunter in the 50s, Clarence Stone in the 60s and 70s, Robert Dahl fighting with them. These are the names we'll read about leadership and how the different patterns of leadership combine and change. And ways of capturing this in a manner that we can compare it to the other patterns as I showed in the path diagram. Okay, that's theory one. Theory two is the market. The national market may operate in a way, not necessarily just in terms of money. That is, money can be seen as a driver, but I would suggest money is better conceived in a manner that the economists do. How do we economists define the discipline? As several of you are in economics. Who wants to suggest a definition of economics? Is economics making more money in the study of making money? Let me ask that and then ask as an answer, what's the definition you learn in Economics 101? Anybody?
Scarcity.
Scarcity, yes, but then what's sort of a follow-up? Maybe a few more words.
It's how would you divide up scarce resources?
Okay, but anything else when anyone wants to disagree or add a little more?
What I have been told about economics, or what I've heard, is the idea that economics is a method for studying various problems, like a method and a set of tools that can be used to study a wide range of problems.
Yes, indeed. Okay, but I mean, both of you are this is useful. Anybody else? How about the idea of maximizing preferences? You heard that? Sometimes people will say that is the core of most economics, most economists will say is not money. It's not, that is, it's scarce resources in the sense that scarcity is recognized explicitly as a constraint, but it's a constraint on preferences. So maximization of preferences subject to exterior constraints, and therefore looking at the best means to get to that end is sort of a way that a lot of the discipline of economics approaches this. But what that leaves out is money, and it's not saying I want to be richer than you, or you're richer than me, or something of that sort. Although many political scientists and sociologists and others, laypersons, think of economics as trying to make people richer, or fighting over money. The reason I'm bringing this in is the classic reading for economic theory here at Chicago and in much of the world is what? Adam Smith. And what was Adam Smith's sort of core idea? What's the title of his book and core idea in the beginning of it?
The Wealth of Nations and the Invisible Hand.
Okay, there we go. The great title, The Wealth of Nations, and tell us about the invisible hand. What's that part?
It's the idea that a free market can eventually stabilize itself and make all the correct decisions by individuals, each making their own decisions that maximize themselves.
Okay, there we go. And the process of that happening is sometimes labeled and termed what? A market, basically. So, okay, so markets and individuals pursuing their own self-interest defined by them individually, instead of saying Black Lives Matter or we're white racists or we're Irish police, that the individuals make their decisions, and but the content of that decision is not defined by the theory. That most classical economics, and this is changing now in the last 20, 30 years, and sometimes earlier before, but not very much. That is, a classical economist will say the content of the preferences is left to other disciplines like sociology or anthropology or something else like that. So when we talk about markets in this, say in this course, we'll talk about land value as was illustrated in the zones as a dependent variable. But in terms of the independent drivers, what the independent variables which make this happen, the idea here, the big idea here is a market, and the invisible hand is the operation of the competitive process moving toward that ideal equilibrium, ideal in the sense of the theory, but recognize that empirically one never achieves an equilibrium. It's always a moving, changing process. If we apply this, we can apply this to investors and investments, and competition can thus go on an economic level. It can go on a second level of citizens can choose to move to a city or leave a city. And in that sense, cities are competing with each other. And if we look at the people over the last 20, 30 years, over from 25 to 34 age category, compare that to the suburban growth and the downtown city growth. Which downtown city in the United States has grown more as a proportion? That is, which downtown is the most successful in increasing the proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds in the U.S.? Austin, Berkeley, Seattle, Tampa, Miami? No. Anybody want to guess? The man with his stars right behind is giving you the answer. Wesley Gow. Chicago has attracted more people to its downtown. I didn't add the downtown I think it's the 4 square mile area, or 4 miles by 4 miles, basically, probably 16 square miles. And the downtown of Chicago has attracted more people than any other downtown in the United States. Chicago is doing something exciting in addition to having Black Lives Matter and looting. We've got things which are bringing a lot of young people here. And unfortunately, it's not, well, it can be the University of Chicago, but we can't claim credit for all of that. There's lots more going on, and we'll talk about in other theories as we proceed here. But the point is, market competition between cities can be a major driver, and cities, either through their private sectors, through jobs or how much they pay, or other things which are going on in that competitive process can join with city government. And here is how the model of Berry, or the critique of Berry of the old Chicago approach, is bad by leaving out politics, because the incentives, the packages of policies which city government leaders like mayors and city council members can transform the ways in which cities are attractive or not, such as having, and what would be, the classic things which are discussed in simple economic terms were taxes, high or low taxes, and then the degree of activeness of the government. So big government, small government, high tax, low tax. These were the classic dimensions of left and right in Europe and the US for political parties. The left and the right parties differed right on in terms of these dimensions. What became more complicated, especially before, but then after this, and in the US, this was termed the New Deal. And after 68, as we had this explosion of, as I illustrated it, not just with one, we did not have just one group. We had anti-Vietnam, we had the beginnings of, we had social issues in the number one, the civil rights movement gave us the model of protesting through Martin Luther King in peaceful manner, not shooting, not breaking windows. And even the militias, I should add, the militias were mostly symbolic. They marched with their guns, but they also had picnics with their families and wives. They would go from Chicago to Milwaukee and the Irish militia in Chicago would have a lunch with the Irish militia in Milwaukee and so forth. The role of government has become more issue specific, and that's a term which has come in with the breakdown of the classic left and right and the rise of multiple issues, such as civil rights, such as Vietnam War, such as, of course, the tweets in the statements of Donald Trump. So what Trump did in 4 years ago was to break all rules to win this election, not based on a strong party program, not based on a strong party, not based on people working for him in the normal manner, and which had been assumed in most of the European and American past context. But many people would credit to an amazing degree, and not even spending his own money. His Twitter tweets, taking positions on individual issues, he has carried on to a degree that has been remarkably successful, and completely refuted the idea that you need a huge war chest of money and you need a huge number of union and campaign workers to be elected. And no one predicted that Trump would win because he broke all these rules. But I'm pointing out the ways in which these traditional patterns and then the new variations of them have combined in ways that undermine the ways that they worked in earlier years. This leads into the third model of political culture. Daniel Elazar, E-L-A-Z-A-R, is the main name here in distinguishing three kinds of paths. And I'll hold them up with my my beautiful hand-drawn map, where we have here the eastern seaboard, down in Florida, where there's an S for south. The middle Atlantic is think Wall Street, the individualistic approach. And the New England is the third. And the arrows show that there were migration patterns that started with the initial immigrants from these areas And then as they went to the West, they continued on and they carried the culture on their shoulders. That is, they brought their culture with them. And this is another model of where the rules and cultures come from. They don't get necessarily invented on a horse. They, in Elazar and most of the traditional ways of thinking about this, culture comes from the past, from long traditions like the Bible and Christianity, or the Torah. And that these conceptions are there for a long term. The 19th century framed these kinds of theories often as so-called simple and sovereign theories, that you just followed one. And if you were a Marxist, you believed, at least in Engels, who invented the term economic determinism. By contrast, Marx was a student of G.F.W. Hegel, and Hegel was sometimes termed a cultural determinist. And Marx would say he took Hegel and he turned him on his head, and then they introduced terms like substructure and superstructure. So the substructure was the economy or the access to the means of production. The superstructure was culture and politics. And so in that sense, this Marxist view in the let's say the Communist Manifesto, the more simple version, was taken as not needing culture to show the driving factors of what drives policy. That culture was, and in many ways, following the 60, in the 19, let's say in bad times to simplify, like the end of the 19th century, the 1930s, and the 68 period, many people were anti-cultural. That is, they said, what matters is money, and we need to get out of a recession, and we don't want to talk about culture. An additional theme was culture. To use the concept of culture means that you're blaming the victim. That was another debate we'll bring in responses to that. But the point is, which I'm suggesting here, is that culture is an ideal way of capturing the little C1, C2, C3. That is, culture is not so easily expressed as an A or a B or a C. We can do that, and the way of doing that is to talk about economic preferences or values of saying, or let's say maybe an individual preference may be a better label here. That if you have a preference for hamburgers with all the toppings, that's different than having a preference for organic vegan food. And that's the simple economic model, that the individual choice will lead to a particular decision. The political culture meaning differs in the sense that it's not just the individual's preference, but it's the rules of the game. Who does what, why? And what we get is a challenge here that Trump has been pushing the envelope and saying, the rules of the game, I'm going to redefine. And so having these kinds of examples of what is right or wrong, what's legitimate, the concept of legitimacy is central here, of building trust and a sense about, and so Max Weber had his three famous concepts of charismatic, bureaucratic, and traditional forms of legitimacy, which are ways of making the world work, and having followers follow you because of these kinds of reasons. The point of the political culture is to point toward a relativism, as do the three types of legitimacy which we take over in the political culture work. That is, it's to say there is no one city which has the right or the wrong rules of the game. These differ, and if we get to Chicago, these differ by neighborhood. So if you're in Bridgeport, the classic Irish political elite core of the Daily organizations and the pre-Daily Irish organizations, the rules of the game were narrow, if you will, to simplify, clientelism, patronage, ethnic politics, and clientelism. Those were the core rules of the game. When Harold Washington ran in 72, 73, his campaign manager, Bill Grimshaw, had a speech which he gave on the North Side, and he mentioned the term reform, and people applauded. They went wild. They said, hey, yes, reform. So Harold Washington ran 3 times. He lost twice. The third time he began talking in the middle of his campaign. He didn't start this way. He picked this up from citizens. And he, with Bill Grimshaw, then implemented this much more successfully and extensively than anybody else in the history of Chicago. He broke the machine. He broke the rule of the game by saying it's immoral and corrupt, and we will make Chicago a more efficient and reformed city. So Laurie Lightfoot, our current mayor, came out of nowhere. Like Trump, she had no organization. She hadn't really built up a serious cadre at all. She had very little money. What she did was attack the establishment, and she was elected, even though it should have been Tony Preckwinkle. She had a much, but both Tony Preckwinkle and her own campaigns in the past, they were fighting this old Irish machine politics style, and their answer was reform. But then the question is, what is reform? And but the point I'm making here is the rules of the game, the how you do the decisions were being challenged, and to some degree, at least among certain elites, successfully transformed. And the book by Robert Dahl called Who Governs on Our Reading List is one of the classic examples of reform in the city of New Haven. Okay. The last version of this is called Globalization, linked with the name of Saskia Sassen and many others now. And it takes the ideas of markets and extends them globally rather than just nationally. The fourth theory is we can link with, say, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, with Jane Jacobs, with Ed Glazer today at Harvard, probably the leading urban economist. Their core idea, popularized by Richard Florida and some others, is innovation is the driver. The key driver is not just preferences, it's not just militias, it's not money, it's ideas, not in the sense of general culture in the Hegelian sense, but specific innovations that you can get a patent for, like a cell phone, a computer program, etc. And that these new ideas in the knowledge economy, hear the term, redefining the whole economy, not around scarce resources, because the cost of oil gets cheaper as more people get solar panels and learn to conserve energy. In these ways, you can transform the value of resources through culture and innovations. And so the innovation and where this is then generated, and Jane Jacobs' idea was Bohemia, the Bohemian neighborhood in her classic New York City Greenwich Village was the archetype. which in turn went back to Balzac and Baudelaire in the 19th century. And then we have within Chicago, Wicker Park as the arts neighborhood in Bohemia. But the spread of this was enhanced by the second date, if you will. I have two dates that I have in my little picture here, 1968 and 1989. 1968, what we've talked about, what happened in 1989, and that has effects on these theories. (1989). Anybody from China? What happened in China in 1989? Anybody from Germany? What happened in Germany in 1989? Okay, the Berlin Wall went down. The Russians said, we are not going to try to impose communism as a structure and a political leadership pattern and a political culture on the Germans in East and West in East Germany. And we're going to let people tear down that wall. That in turn was also held across Eastern Europe, and within a few years, the entire Soviet Union was abolished. Shouldn't say abolished. Individual countries, nations broke out from the Soviet Union. And the most recent example in fighting terms was the Ukraine, core of the Soviet Union. And so these movements toward independence, breaking away, are part of changes in political culture and changes linked as well with, we can find elements of politics, of egalitarianism, and more, including the kinds of protests in front of city halls that we had in '68. So the combination, so the other piece of this is 1989 was the end, in simple terms, the end of the Cold War. If we have the end of the Cold War, what do we have instead? The simple answer is globalization. We have more open competition between countries, firms, individuals who can move around a lot more easily. And so Amazon can sell and buy products. We can have Chinese and Mexican imports, and that in turn can lead to a Trump fighting back and saying, I'm against rapists. And so that kind of politicization of these issues, which we have today, is nevertheless undergirded by a sense of egalitarianism and openness. And we can see this happening across Chicago neighborhoods. I live in Bronzeville. I've lived here the whole time I've been at the university, most of my adult life. My neighborhood friends, African-American teenagers, Friday and Saturday night, they don't stay in Bronzeville. They go to the north side. And there are more and more clubs, some of which were initially predominantly Black. Now they may change, but where and how the criteria of egalitarianism may be imposed and acted on more equally is a '68 ideal, and it's being applied to neighborhoods in a more precise way in discussions within the city of Chicago right now. Let me mention the last theory, then we need some little discussion. Okay, the last theory is the rise of the arts, consumption, time use, leisure, the intermingling of play and work, of high and low culture, of how all these things can be joined together that in the past have been largely left to specialists. So if you knew about Picasso, or let's say the Mona Lisa, you may not have known much about that, but the idea that the Mona Lisa or Picasso or certain kinds of Christian rap could transform politically or organize socially was used by Martin Luther King. in his protests, people would pray and they would sing protest songs in ways that continued. That is, this went back to the Civil War, but this has become, some have argued, a new major driver in transforming the meaning and heightening the emotions and the engagement of people to turn out and vote, because they say he's immoral, and I will sing a song, or I will think of ways in which I have seen a video or a movie which has articulated in a rap song a black mobilization or a rock alternative or another theme. Beyonce, the brief statements with the awarding of prizes, the comments after these have become not just, quote, symbolic, these have become drivers of a number of decisions, in part because corruption, as attacked by the reformers and Harold Washington in Chicago, has become so widely accepted, including in China. But certainly in the Western Europe and the US, fighting corruption is in some terms, the #1 policy concern of many local officials. But that in turn limits the ability of patronage jobs and workers to come behind you. So what can you do? You can try to do Twitter tweets, but if you don't use just Twitter tweets, these could be rap songs which are used by gangs in Chicago to mobilize against other gangs. So I'll leave that with that provocative statement and say, questions or comments, as we've got just a few minutes at the end for today. In general, I'll try to leave a little more time for discussion, but I wanted to get these out to help us get started. We'll also have more, we will use more videos, we'll have more people come in and speak on some of these issues, but questions, comments on anything that you want to raise now, please. Unmute yourself and speak out. One question to any is, how much of this have you heard before? Have you heard any or all of these 5 theories? I bet you've not heard these 5 put together as we have here. And I guess it's implicit, but maybe not. I'll say it's obvious. People are fighting over these theories right now. I mentioned the LA, Chicago, and New York so-called schools. But we'll talk about that and who and why. Questions, comments? Mary Kay, Mary Kay Hansen, you look a little bit puzzling, a little bit query. What's on your head at this point?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to look puzzled.
No, that's okay. But I'm calling on you to say, give us a little something to think about besides, or that is all good? Is everything I said good, or some things, nothing challenged you just a little bit?
I think like the 5 theories all put together challenged me a little bit, just because it seems like I don't really know which one is right. So it'll be interesting, but yeah, I'm good.
Okay, what's the implicit answer in this picture? To answer your implicit question, which theory is right?
All of them like play into the answer.
There we go. There we go. They're all still right, but the question is, how big is the A or the B or the C, the lowercase a, B, C? And so, and the way that we can answer is not just with the past, but with the little C1, C2. Cities differ, and by comparing cities and comparing neighborhoods, we can learn how and why number of theory 1 versus theory 2 versus theory 5 can be more important. So anybody want to elaborate any of that thinking? Where have you heard this idea before? Or whatever. Wesley Gao, you had some comments before that kept us on target. Anything you want to follow up with to push us a little further with a discussion?
I guess I'm interested to see how broad scale globalization will affect sort of smaller cities all around the country and how they all tie together.
All right, big question for sure. And we will talk about that. And just a one sentence possible answer has been called Hollywoodization or McDonaldization, that they all get the same. They become the same because of those forces. And then other places like Boulder, Colorado have said, we will not issue any zoning permits to big boxes. We don't want any big box Hollywoodization in Boulder. We want this place to be locally unique, and we want local culture. So these are fought over not just by theoreticians, these are fought over by mayors and people who campaign on them. Green zones, etc. Just on the last theory, can anyone think of a Chicago example that illustrates that the two theories, if we want to frame them that way, between the North Michigan, north of the Chicago River for 1 mile, what's it called? Where you have the big high-end designer stores and high prices, and where the looting has been particularly visible.
The Magnificent Mile.
Okay, that's righto. What's the South Mile, South Michigan labeled? And how does it fit with the different theory? It's on, look around and you'll see it. It's now in marble about one mile south, and it's called the Cultural Mile. The Cultural Mile fits with Theory 5, that Chicago has been, since with Daley 2, one of the most active cities in the world in using culture actively to transform the city and its politics and its economy. That's why not only Chicago, but internationally, we can see the workings of art and culture transforming the economy in Chicago examples. All right, we're at the end of time. We will have office hours right now, right after this class, sometimes on Wednesday, and we'll have office, oh, I didn't let the teaching, we have, well, let's do it next time, and we'll let our teaching assistants talk a little bit more, but stay on right now, talk to me, talk to the teaching assistants, and anyone is welcome to stay on for any kind of question or issue you may have, and we'll stay with you and have office hours. The rest of you are free to head off to the Cultural Mile or wherever you want to go next.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have anybody staying on for an office hour type question? Maybe a couple of names are still there, but maybe they're just not actively working. But Andy and Gray, I can introduce you to each other. We don't have things officially processed, but I'm delighted that you can see each other. Why don't you briefly introduce, is anybody else with us? Gabe Solis, Jillian Freed, Philip Martini? Yeah, they're probably just walking away from their machines, but why don't you two introduce yourselves to each other, as I apologize for having talked too long. That's a weakness I have to work on.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
here we go. Gabe Solis. Anything you wanna raise?
Not really, honestly.
Okay,
I had you for urban innovation last spring, so it's nice to see you once again.
terrific. Are you in California right now or in Chicago?
I'm back out in Chicago.
Okay, well, terrific.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Have a good one.
Very good. Same to you. Okay, Jimmy Kelly, you here? No. Okay. Andy and Gray, why don't you introduce yourselves to one another a little bit?
Hi, I'm Gray. I'm a third-year PhD student in the sociology department. I'm coming from Philadelphia. I got my first master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied historic preservation and studied gay bathhouses while I was there. I worked for 3 years after that at a nonprofit where I worked on some issues around urban design and urban planning, doing some museum work and oral histories. My work at University of Chicago focuses on LGBT health and medicine, but I still have a focus on studying urban areas in particular, accessing healthcare and things like that. I work down at the NORC, which is the National Opinion Research Center. I took an urban class last year. I am looking forward to reading some of these readings I haven't read before, but I have delved into them, and they are focused on like a lot of my interests as well. And they're yeah, and I've also been a writing intern in the Corps, so that's a little bit about my teaching experience. And I don't know if it's important to you to use no pronouns, but I use he, him.
Okay, now that we are recording, I'll just mention now, and I'd say this is fine to have you, just leave this on. Andy, if you want to say things that you're comfortable recording, and after we finish that, if we want, we can shut off the recording, and then we can have a conversation. But Andy, if you want to briefly introduce yourself for folks who will see this on YouTube or whatever, please do. Are you muted? Yeah, we don't hear you. Maybe you just click on your own picture and your own image, and you can unmute yourself. Can you hear? If you hear me, wave if you hear me, Andy. Okay. If you use your cursor and click on the picture you can see of yourself, and it ought to give you unmute as an option. Although maybe if you're the host, yeah, you're the host, aren't you? Yeah, maybe there's something else you need to do. I don't know. Maybe lower left. Yeah, lower left in the whole Zoom image. There's something called mute. Maybe that's got a red line through it. Okay, well, you've done so well with hosting that
Okay, can you hear me now?
yes, indeed.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. I'm Andy. My given name is Amanda, but I prefer Andy. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I am a master's student in quantitative methods in social analysis. And specifically, I am interested in studying patterns of immigrant and refugee settlement in cities, potentially looking at how different cities take different approaches. But I'm excited to do these readings and interact with these students and just learn more about how cities work. And yeah, I think that's about everything. Oh, I'm also a recent graduate of the college. I studied math and Near Eastern languages and civilizations, and I graduated last spring.
Okay, so and both of you are very smart. You've got stunning records of distinction in whatever you've done. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. And, well, why don't we turn off the recording now, if we could, and we can just talk among the